Our next speaker has had a very distinguished career in American higher education. Recently took a year's leave of absence from her present job to serve as a commissioner on the Atomic Energy Commission. Is now back in Cambridge at the work she has been doing for quite a while as president of Radcliffe, someone whom a good many of you know quite well. It's my pleasure to present Mrs. Mary Bunting.
Friends, I should like to use my few minutes here this evening to give you a kind of progress report on my findings and thoughts in this field, much as I might report on recent experiments in the laboratory. In doing this, I'd like to touch very quickly on and remind a few of you of how my own thinking has developed here, but I'm particularly interested in some new aspects that have impressed me just this year. I'm particularly interested in the fact that the things I'd like to emphasize tonight, the things I'm most interested in, are really quite different from the points I would have emphasized if I'd spoken to you a year ago. Reminding you quickly of this development in my own thinking, I really grew up, went to college, went on to graduate school, believing that this whole problem had been licked long ago, and honestly not very interested in it. I wasn't aware of any particular personal problems as I went along. I might question other women's taste in the way they chose to live their lives, but not their freedom to make their decisions, and so forth. As I'm watching the students I talk with this year, I'm suddenly beginning to wonder whether some of the freedom that women earned through the 1940s and 50s when they said no to continuing education, when they said, I want to stay home, whether this wasn't very important, a very important step in what I see now emerging. I'm reminded of the way children grow up, you know, and they go through that phase when they say yes to every question you ask them, and then in a few months later they say no to every question you ask them, and then they seem to be free to say yes or no. And I wonder whether something of the same process may not have had to happen culturally. I don't know anything about this. My own interest in the problem was aroused post-Sputnik, but when we came to realize, as we were, some of us were thinking about, more scientific brain power, and wondering what was happening to identified brain power, when we discovered that of the identified bright young people in high school, and we didn't worry so much at that time about the ones who didn't show up because they hadn't had a chance. But in terms of the identified ones, you know, in the top 10% by ability tests, when we discovered that more than 95%, maybe 98, 99% of those who did not go on to college were females, that one startled me and aroused my interest in this whole problem. And the clue, as I looked on this, came from the fact that the government tried to suppress this statistic, that this was censored, really. And this led me to think that America really didn't believe it would make any important difference. That as long as all the bright young men were going on, everything was okay. And that there really was a climate, what I called a climate of unexpectation as to what women would do with their talents and education. And that very likely this was the key, because the thing that worried me, you see, was why weren't these girls going on? There was the manpower problem, but more important, in my view, was the fact that they were missing so much, and why weren't they going on? And so my hypothesis, and these, it's a very crude hypothesis, was that this climate dissuaded them, that it got in the way of their motivation, that it also got in the way of the motivation of educational institutions, and so that they didn't really try awfully hard to do anything about this. And I began to see that even the women's colleges were awfully interested in training them up to the bachelor's degree, but not awfully concerned with what you needed to do beyond then. That the women's colleges were the slowest about admitting a married woman or a part-time one, and so forth, that they weren't awfully interested. Well, this was a pretty useful hypothesis, and an awful lot of things seemed to fall into place, like the way people talk to little children, and this business about the women's colleges, and lack of research on what you're doing about this whole half of the population, and some of the exceptions fell in line too. And so I started, trying to do little experiments, like getting them to Douglas College to admit the women part-time in the city who wanted to go on to get their degrees, and a number of other experiments, one of the larger ones being the Radcliffe Institute, to try in that case to really show, do something to change the climate a little bit. To indicate that we really did value what those women who happened to get educated and happened to be motivated might want to do with it, and maybe if Radcliffe valued it, someone else would, and so forth. Well, so much for background. Now, just a few minutes on the rather dramatic change that I believe is taking place now. In the way young women are planning their lives. I don't know whether I'm more impressed as I grow older with how hard it is to make changes or how easy. You can argue either side of this. I don't think it's the things particularly that have happened, at Radcliffe or Minnesota or any other place that has affected this change half so much as civil rights, Phillips Brooks House, the look we've begun to take at some of the things that need to be done in our society. In any event, I think that today the young women whom I'm talking with assume, as they have for a long time, that they want to get married, that they want to have families, that they want to give considerable time to this. But I find now that they are absolutely assuming also that there's some important job they want to do way on down the line, and that it's going to take a lot of preparation to get ready for this. Whereas once it looked so far down the line that there was a little feeling of why bother, that now it looks so far down the line that they have the feeling we got plenty of time to really get ready. And this kind of planning is going on. Let me give you just one example. I could give you any number from recent conversation. One of my early ones was a girl who said, "Yeah, I'm heading for hospital management. I'm concentrating in economics here now. I'm expecting to go to medical school. I'll read sociology and things like that when the children are little. Maybe the books will be better by then. I'll be ready eventually to do a job in hospital management." Well, this is the kind of talking I'm beginning to hear all around, and I think it's quite different. I don't hear much worry about whether the education they're getting in college is relevant to their later life. I think that's just gone out on the whole. And this isn't, I don't think this is just a Radcliffe phenomenon. I talked about this in Texas a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of the girls came up to me afterward and they said, that's exactly what we think. We hadn't realized it, but that's exactly the way we feel. It's not an awfully competitive sort of thing in a way. They're not talking hard about, I'm going to be a lawyer or I'm going to be a doctor, but I'm going to work on hospital management, I'm going to work on urban development, I'm going to get this training on the way. Very serious interest in getting ready. As one girl said the other night when a group came in, one of them said, yeah, we're all going to fix something, Mrs. Bundy. And I said, for instance, and they went around the room and they knew what they were going to fix. There's also the feeling that some of them mentioned that women have some very special advantages. As one of them said, the pattern of a woman's life, this lingo, may be a handicap in the rat race for position, but for what I want to do, it might be a distinct advantage. Or as another one who's planning to go into surgery, hospital surgery, said, a woman doesn't need to worry that much about money. Either I get married and I won't need too much to earn too much myself, or I won't get married and I don't need to earn too much. There's a kind of serenity about this. Well, the real point I'd like to make, and I'm trying to make this wherever I can, to the people who may ought to be getting ready, is that we've got a great many young women in America now who are motivated to go on. That the bottleneck now is going to be at the graduate and professional level. And that the real question now is about the motivation of our graduate and professional schools. There are going to be two things needed, because these young women are not going to postpone marriage or children, perhaps, indefinitely to get this long education that they want. There are going to be two things needed, and one is the flexibility that was mentioned. They're going to need some of them to break for a while or to take it part-time for a while and so forth. The other thing that they're going to need is money. I think there's no question about this. One of the studies we're starting now at the Radcliffe Institute is a study of the educational background and aspirations of the wives of graduate students in the Boston area. There are thousands of them. And I think to get this story and see this picture, here are these thousands tied into our universities and fenced out in so many cases. And right at the moment when geographically and in terms of time they could be going on, so many are kept out. And I suspect that one of the big reasons will turn out to be financial. So that there's going to be a new pressure on this whole thing resulting from the point of view of these young women. I think 1/10 of them from Radcliffe this year at least are planning to go to medical school. More than 1/10 are planning to go to law school, and so forth and so on. And I think that our graduate and professional schools now have really got to wake up to a different kind of challenge, and that it's going to be very interesting to watch it. Thank you.
The Harvard Law School quinquennial contains the names of all Harvard Law School graduates with the LLB, the LLM, the SJD, all persons who flunked out of Harvard Law School, all persons who attended Harvard Law School and didn't flunk out of the school, didn't get any degrees, does not have the name of Miss Pauli Murray, though I think after she finishes telling you of her experience, you will agree with me it probably should be there. But she'll tell you about that. She is a lawyer. She has just recently been a senior tutor at Yale Law School after a law work at Howard and at Berkeley and at Yale. She has been a practitioner, a government lawyer. I don't have any doubt that you are going to enjoy listening to her, as I have for just a short time before the session began. Miss Pauli Murray.
Friends, I'm glad to be here. It's true that I'm 22 years late. It is also true that I would have paid any money to be here tonight. And thereby hangs a tale. Most of us have been very concerned in recent years about dropouts, but nobody seems to have been concerned about a drop-in. Your president tonight looked over the biographical sketches, and he said, gee, you certainly have degrees from coast to coast. And I didn't answer him. I will answer him now. It was not necessary for me to go to coast. I could have settled it all at Harvard 22 years ago, in 2 years. Harvard inadvertently granted me 2 degrees. The Bachelor of Feminism in 1944 and the Masters of Feminism in 1946. And I am here tonight to take my oral examination in the Doctorate of Feminism, but I am not sure that I see my inquisitors. In 1944, I finished Howard Law School, top of my class. Now, don't get excited. As you know, top of your class simply means that it's good on paper and you have a better chance of getting a job. And it wasn't difficult to do it in 1944 because the Army had all the competition and the opposition. But nevertheless, the top man in my class wore skirts. Moreover, won a Rosenwald Fellowship which specified for graduate work at Harvard. All the men in my class and the professors in the school, most of whom were Harvard graduates, held degrees and graduate degrees from Harvard, laughed in derision. I have never been known to lay down on a dare, so I forthwith applied to Harvard. And we went through the regular procedure of getting the undergraduate transcript. They asked for a picture. So I sent them one of my little pictures, and I wrote to Hunter College and said, send them up a manuscript. Well, there was a gentleman by the name of Mr. T.R. Powell. I think he is dead now, and I guess it was before your time. Mr. T.R. Powell was the chairman of the graduate committee. He wrote back and said, Dear Miss Murray, the salutation on your undergraduate transcript, at that time Hunter College was all women, and your picture indicate that you are not of the sex entitled to be admitted into Harvard. I have an excellent memory. That is practically photogenic. Well, it is said that a lawyer who represents himself as a fool for a client. I was a brash young law school graduate, and I was my first client. So I promptly appealed to the Board of Overseers and indicated that I wished to go to Harvard Law School. And meanwhile, the president, Mr. Roosevelt, in the White House, was a distinguished alumnus or alumni of Harvard. And in those days, when we didn't like anything, we always wrote the president, so I wrote the president. But I tried to beat the system, so I also wrote Mrs. Roosevelt and sent her a copy. And knowing that Mrs. Roosevelt was a real feminist at heart, I said, someday when you have a chance, will you slip this to the president? I didn't trust the male side of the ladder, you see. And I thought my letter would get lost in Secretary 16's pigeonhole. Well, sure enough, Mrs. Roosevelt did pass the letter on to Mr. Roosevelt, and he got a great kick out of it. Because I said, you know, Mr. Roosevelt, you're a distinguished alumnus of this school, and you know that this is where people go and get the prestige degrees, and they become judges, and they become presidents and whatnot. And women who are lawyers want the same opportunity. And Mr. Roosevelt, FDR Sr., was, in a sense, a feminist. He was never threatened by women. He, I think, appointed the first cabinet member, woman cabinet member, Secretary Perkins. So he wrote a very genial and amusing letter to President Conant and said, there's a young woman who wants to get into Harvard. And President Conant must have looked up the record. And then he got very, very excited because he thought, oh my, they'll think that we are discriminating on the basis of race, and we can't have Harvard's reputation impeached like that. And so President Conant hurriedly wrote back to President Roosevelt and said, why, of course we don't discriminate on the basis of race. Why, of course Miss Murray can come to Radcliffe, and I am having my secretary send all the Radcliffe catalogs. The only thing, Radcliffe didn't give a master's degree in law. At which point, the Board of Overseers, or the Board of Governors, whatever the governing body of Harvard is, met. And they decided they had nothing to decide upon because they had received no recommendation from the faculty. You can see that I was just out of law school and had not anticipated that move. They forthwith informed me that they had made no decision because there was no motion or recommendation before them. I then reapplied to the faculty, having been a good law student, and I said, will you please ask the faculty to recommend to the Board of Governors that I be admitted to Harvard Law School. Meanwhile, all of the members of the Board of Governors who I knew personally, one of Lloyd K. Garrison, who was one of the members at that time, said, Paulie, you haven't got a chance. Harvard has been that way 3,300 years, and it isn't likely ever to change. I, however, didn't know that. I was quite ignorant of tradition and how important tradition is. The faculty met again, but also anticipating that they were going to reject me. The only other school in the country that had a full-time faculty of the masters in those days, and in those days you would go to a university because it had certain professors. The only other law school in the country was the University of California, which had all of the sort of the almost retiring products of Harvard University. So that's where I wound up, on the other coast. When I arrived to register at the University of California, they said, oh, you're that girl who split the Harvard faculty 7-7 on your application to enter. I had only wished there had been an 8th one, and he was on my side, because this would have saved me 3,000 miles and 2 years, but nevertheless, there it was. The graduate degree was gotten at California. I returned east, And it was then I learned that Harvard had taken a giant step. They had appointed Soya Menshnikov, first woman faculty member. I thought, oh, this is wonderful. It's a chance for us students. So I forthwith reapplied. Dean Griswold in those days was chairman of the graduate committee. And Dean Griswold wrote back in very solemn tones. And he said, our full-time faculty has not yet returned from their war assignments, and we have returning veterans. And we cannot consider the question of women until we have dealt with the question of returning veterans. 3 years later, I read in the newspaper that Harvard Law School had voted to admit women. But by this time, all my scholarship funds were gone, and it wasn't possible for me to go to graduate school. So this is how I got the Bachelor of Feminism degree. It should be clear by now that from the three speakers in the platform, the word women as a stereotype should be dispensed with. I seriously doubt whether there are three individuals who could approach this problem from more diverse points of view than the three individuals that you have here. Let me start my remarks, and I want to be very careful because I see we're running quite late, and so I will be brief and you can get at me in the discussion. I want to throw out for your consideration some thoughts that were advanced last year at a panel discussion at the University of California Medical Center called the Biologic Avalanche Challenge to Women. And this had to do with the population explosion that we are facing worldwide as well as the United States. And what did this mean in terms of its challenge to women? What role would women play either in preventing this avalanche or slowing it down? What did it mean in terms of world problems, social, political, economic, and otherwise? One of the panelists was Dr. Mira Komarovsky, head of the sociology department at Barnet. She made what I thought was a very perceptive analysis. She pointed out that 100 years ago, men in America, and I must say at this point, white men, because Negro men hardly figured into the picture, had exclusive privileges, by and large, for education, the exclusive right to vote and the political power, and therefore it was very logical and very natural that they should excel in all of the significant areas of public life and private industry and enterprise. That 100 years later, we've been faced with a technological revolution and a human rights revolution. And unless you consider these rumblings from the feminine side of the nation in the context of the human rights revolution, of which the Negro Revolution is a very noisy and more articulate part at this moment, unless you see this in a context of world revolution, you will continue to make jokes about it and to laugh and to talk about women. But it is very, very serious business, and let us not kid ourselves. Dr. Komarovsky pointed out that in this era of exclusive power and privilege and right to education, she suspected that men had equated supremacy and superior status with masculinity. And they had confused the two concepts. That 100 years later, with the technological revolution and with the world revolution in human rights, this status, privilege, and power was being challenged. And having identified it with masculinity, the challenge to the privilege and the power seemed in fact to be a challenge to masculinity, and that in this lies much of the confusion about women's rights, individuality, and whatnot. This analysis deeply impressed me. I throw it out to you for what it is worth. I want to talk a little bit about women's rights as citizens. And I want you again to keep it into this larger context. 40 years ago, women won the vote. 46 years, I guess, ago, won the vote. And they thought that they were citizens. They thought they had full political rights. Here in the great liberal state of Massachusetts, the cradle of liberty and abolitionism, Crispus Attucks, the Boston Common, Paul Revere, a woman was arrested on a minor criminal charge and tried and convicted by an all-male jury. And she immediately appealed the conviction on the ground that she had not been charged, convicted, or tried before a jury of her peers, i.e., a jury on which women were represented. This obviously was a violation of the 14th Amendment. She had all of the precedent she needed. She had a whole line of Negro cases which had shown that where Negroes are systematically excluded from juries, this is a violation of their rights under the Equal Protection. And the majestic Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts ruled that even though the 19th Amendment was now passed, and even though the qualifications for jurors under the Massachusetts law said all persons who are qualified electors shall be jurors, it was not a violation of the 14th Amendment for women still to be excluded from jury service in the state of Massachusetts. Now let me take you to the ultimate and logical result of that ruling. The Supreme Court ducked the issue. It refused certification of the case and did not review it. This then appeared to remain the law of the land, and the great and doughty warriors of woman suffrage who had fought and gone to jail and carried on demonstrations not unlike the demonstrations we have witnessed in the last 3 years, felt that they had been deemed by the court not to be persons within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States, that there was a constitutional gap, and that the only way that women could be recognized as full citizens was to have an Equal Rights Amendment. And they fought for the next 40 years to get this Equal Rights Amendment. And while they were fighting, the states did various things with jury laws. Some admitted women as jurors, some gave women blanket exemptions, some made women go down to the courthouse and register their desire to serve as jurors before they would be put on the jury list. And 3 states, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina, by statute excluded women altogether. It is not surprising that these were 3 southern states in which we have had many of our problems in race relations. It is no historical accident that of the 10 states in the country which refused to ratify the 19th Amendment, the Equal Suffrage Amendment, only one of them, Delaware, was above the Mason and Dixon line. The other were the 9 states were the 9 of the former slaveholding states. And if you will check your annotated Constitution, Corwin's edition, 1952, you will find that 7 of those 9 actually voted to reject the Equal Suffrage Amendment. In 1955 to 1965, there have been 89 race-related deaths by violence growing out of the Civil Rights Revolution and crisis in the South. Of those 89, summarized by the Southern Regional Council, so far as we have been able to determine, there have been only 6 convictions. The 2 acquittals, which probably sent us all into shock last midsummer, were the acquittal of the accused slayer of Mrs. Viola Liuzzo, followed immediately by the acquittal of the accused slayer of the young Episcopal seminarian from New Hampshire, both either acquitted or by a hung jury by all white, all male jurors. And we found from the Department of Justice experience that where there had been women on those Southern juries, the Department of Justice had increased its chances of getting a conscientious and impartial trial. So let no one say that that case that we just won in Alabama, and I was one of the 5 lawyers on the brief, Judge Dorothy Kenyon was the second, and we were the ones who wrote the sex discrimination argument, and the court came right down the line actually using our language. I would say that after so many losses and so many failures and so many defeats in a lifetime, this was my sweetest victory today. Our concern was not nearly so much the rights of women, although those by themselves would have been sufficient, and we would not have had to apologize for them. But we are trying to find an alternative to the turmoil and the anarchy in the South. And if we are to have law and order in these states, particularly in South Carolina and particularly in Mississippi and Alabama, and in perhaps a lesser degree in Louisiana, we must have an impartial jury system where Negro civil rights workers and white civil rights workers feel that they will get justice if they themselves are defendants, and where people will feel that if they are, by any horrible chance, murdered or beaten or their civil rights are taken from them, that the Department of Justice can go into those courts and punish the wrongdoers. And we immediately saw that not only were all the Negro males excluded from these juries, but all women. And so in Lowndes County, where these 2 murders took place, and where you got these acquittals by all white, all male juries, when you analyze the population, the adult population between 21 and 65, you found that 84% of the adult population potentially available for jury service were completely excluded, either by administrative practice, i.e. the Negro males, or by statute, all females, white and black, leaving 16% only of the adult population of jury age available for jury duty, and this meant 738 names of white males. Of those 738, only 630 appeared on the jury list, and of those 630, 221 accounted for 66% of all the persons called for jury duty. Some of these 221 appeared 5 and 6 times, and some even as many as 15 and 16 times. And therefore you had the most unrepresentative type of jury that it is possible to find in a county, a petty jury system in the United States. And those of you who have studied constitutional law know this is in direct contradiction to the modern trend, which is toward a representative jury as a cross-section of the community, the public interest that we have in having such a jury in order to have impartial trials. It is obvious that with me, I have had no choice but to fight for women's rights and to fight for Negroes' rights, And it will very soon be that I will have no choice but to fight for the rights of the aged. I am rapidly qualifying. I am also practically congenitally left-handed, so I'm always to the left in every situation, a little bit askew. And so I had nothing to lose but to want to be an individual. And this is my third and final observation. Nature does not ask us where she distributes brains, intellect, talent, drive. She simply scatters these with the recombination of the genes. In some ways, I might have been disadvantaged to have been born a Negro in white America, a woman in a man's profession, left-handed in a right-handed world, and I might throw in even an orphan at an early age. But there were certain advantages in this status, which I didn't see then, but I see in retrospect. Negroes, as you know, are out of the mainstream of America. And being out of the mainstream, I didn't know there was any such thing as a woman's place. I was out there having a gay old time with complete freedom of thought. My parents were dead. I lived with my grandparents. They were older people. They didn't have time to keep up with what a youngster was doing. And so I had none of the restrictions intellectually that many children are forced into today. I therefore came to sex discrimination much later than I came to race discrimination. And having fought the battle of race discrimination, I began to see how integrally these two discriminations were. Since I could not split myself, and since I had to be a unified human being, I decided that it was not I that was wrong, but the society that was wrong. And that any time a society penalizes an individual because of a biological attribute, whether it be race per se or whether it be sex per se, that society is going to be challenged. Now, I'm not going to exhort or have any exhortations about what women should do and what the men should let us do. You note that I come out of a struggle of a minority which has now so determined it says either America is going to let us in or we will keep America on its head for the rest of our lives. And this minority has demonstrated its capacity to do it. As a woman, in terms of the legal rights of women as citizens, who have both a right and a responsibility to share the levers of power of this country, I am not going to exhort the men to let us in. And now I speak to the budding members of my profession, the women who are studying law. The Negroes set the stage for a revolution by digging into the law books, burning the midnight hours, coming up with persuasive legal documentation and argument, the sheer logic of which forced a Supreme Court continually to retread its earlier movement. This was not done entirely by Negroes alone. The whole world economic conditions and social conditions and social revolutions were playing. But basically these lawyers in their lonely law offices many hours at night were fighting the battle of the law books, and on sheer logic by itself persuaded those judges to respect their point of view. On February 7th, 1966, when a three-district federal court came down unequivocally and said that the 14th Amendment applies to prejudicial disparities among all citizens, including women, I did not need a Harvard law degree. Thank you.
They liked it. I take it they liked it.
The hour is late, and we want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. I think in order to take care of those who want to get home at a reasonable hour, I will simply be arbitrary and limit the question period to not more than 15 minutes under any circumstances. In other words, not later than 10:20. And, of course, if your questions don't come at all, or if you just sort of whimper out before 10:20, then we'll know where you stand on the issue. If there are any people who want to stay after 10:20 and ask questions informally, I have no doubt they will be welcome. And so, my first point is, who would like to start the questioning? I should add that anyone who wishes to ask a question is requested to come to this microphone at the foot of the hall in order that his question may be heard on the tape that's being made of this whole program. He should also state his name and indicate to whom he is addressing his question. Notice my pronouns. Fine.
Ideas.
My name is Mark Finley. I just wondered if there isn't some subtle discrimination going on here right now. I noticed in the program there's a Nancy Sheckman on the Harvard Law School forum.
You haven't indicated to whom you're addressing the question.
Well, I'm just stating the question first there.
Would you tell us to whom you are addressing the question?
Samuel Doctor. Samuel Doctor.
All right.
But Nancy Sheckman is listed here, and she has no part in the proceedings. I'd just like to see her. Is she here?
May I exercise simply the moderator's prerogative and ask Ms. Sheckman to please stand up? She arranged the entire program, as I understand, and had a great deal to do with it. Now, may we have a question? Anybody who wants to follow the questioner who is speaking is asked to come forward and indicate by just standing there that they want to ask the next question. Go ahead.
Andrew Newman to Mr. Dent. You all seem to agree that there's a problem, and Ms. Duncan says that the bottleneck is in higher education, and Ms. Murray says that the problem is in the law, and I wonder what you want to do about it. I've heard nothing constructive from your point of view. You say that women do things which men do not take seriously, and you mentioned homemaking and volunteer work, being secretaries, etc. And I wonder, should women start doing different things, or should we start taking seriously what they're doing now?
May I answer my part in one word and get it over with?
I don't know whether Mrs. Fredan wants to answer first. I was going to give you each a chance.
Just one word. I have to call the tune on the question, you don't do anything constructive. I have been calling for a sharing of power from the presidency of the United States down to the sheriff. Now, this may be destructive because it will destroy privilege, but in my book, it's constructive.
Well, you see, homemaking isn't ruled out by what I say. The fact of life is that women in America, and with the lifespan they have today, simply cannot, for the most part, use all their abilities or all their years productively only in homemaking. So merely to ask that, and I don't agree with Mrs. Bunning that the problem is all solved. I see declining numbers of women in all the, still, in all the professions, and in all of the professions that are going to exist in the future world, with when the secretaries, for instance, are going to be replaced, and the bookkeepers and the bank tellers by automation. Most of the jobs women now hold outside the home will be automated out of existence. There is no way for women to use their lives and years productively within the homes, unless they begin to have, say, 10 and 12 child families, and even then they're going to have half their lives after their childbearing years are over. So they must be able to get the kind of higher education that Mrs. Dunning is talking about, which means very much now, in these years, professional education, although there will be new professions and occupations emerging. I think to take more seriously what women now do, well, there's been a whole stream of propaganda for 20 years trying to say occupation housewife, we should make it a sacred thing. It requires more ability than to be an atomic scientist, you know, and combination chauffeur, gardener, cook, and all the rest. True, you know, we all do these things, women who have children in homes, whether we're also college presidents or whether we do nothing beyond the dishwashing and the PTA. But I submit that since 50% of the women in America are by definition above average, you know, let's at least, and this is probably the proportion that intimately concerns the people here, at least let's use these abilities in the most productive possible way in society. And prejudices have to be erased to do this. Images have to be created, and new patterns in society have to be instituted, whether they're nursery schools and different ideals, for instance, of childrearing, which suppose that the mother's life is as important as the child's, that the mother's time is not to be spent primarily in soaping as the child. The child could ride the bicycle himself, you know, things like that. To part-time patterns in graduate school, and to perhaps, I disagree that we can't counteract this early marriage thing. I certainly think we can counteract too early motherhood. In India, child marriage is seen as the evil it is for the deterrent of the woman's growth. It is equally an evil for a young Radcliffe girl to take so with little seriousness her education, to think that she shouldn't plan in terms of her own future. She can put the boy through law school and maybe take up urban development some years later. I've seen those girls some years later. They're very worthy citizens. But the city of Washington is full of ones who would love to do something in urban development, but they cannot meet the professional qualifications to get hired by any of the agencies who deal with urban development. And unless they have rich husbands, they're not very likely to get the professional education at 45 that they didn't get at 25.
Let's see, who was the next person?
I'm Kay Ryan. I'm at the Harvard Law School. I addressed my question to Mrs. Bunting. It wasn't exactly clear to me what you meant by saying that the graduate and professional schools would have to take a different approach. I'm sure you have rather concrete ideas, and I'd like to have the benefit of them if you would like to expound on them a bit.
Thank you. Just quickly, first may I say that I don't think the problems are all solved, of course. I just was trying to point out tonight some interesting changes that I think are going on in the way young women are looking ahead. And although I think there is a real shift, certainly among Radcliffe students, in terms of of the age at which they get married. And I don't think that they are planning to postpone this beyond the time that they would, let's say, necessarily finish an internship if they go on to medical school. I think that the kind of plan they're making is one of finishing college, and then somewhere along in the next period they expect to get married. And instead of having a big gap later, what they'd like to do is continue their education through along with their family responsibilities, and that this is going to take a new flexibility on the part of our professional schools and graduate education, and a willingness to value this kind of preparation so that they will be ready later, a willingness to help them financially, even though they're working part-time. These two things are going to be essential for this new pattern to develop. And it's this that I have in mind particularly.
There seems to be a trend in the pattern of development, and that is that most of you sort of addressed yourself to the question of women, their attitude towards their roles. And Mrs. Bunting, to a certain extent, is to the new interest of women, Miss Murray perhaps to some of the legal possibilities. I wonder what your two feeling is about changing men's attitudes, which you haven't gone into in any great detail, and whether that is in some way necessary in your overall goal.
Your name, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Peter Kuboff from the law school.
Well, I haven't ever thought there was any great significance to the ideas of men about these problems or of women about these problems as such. It has seemed to me that as I first got interested in this, that there was a whole climate, and that it affected most men and most women, and that there were exceptions on both sides, and that this thing better be looked at that way, rather than talking about men's point of view or women's point of view.
I thought I suggested very clearly how to change people's attitudes. There is nothing so educative than a successful challenge to power. This we all know. We've seen it happen in the Civil Rights Revolution. I was one of the student sit-inners in the 1940s, but all they did to us was just arrest us, carry us off to jail. Nobody knew about it because we had no power. We were a handful, 10 or 12. So when 50,000 Negroes began marching in the streets, Washington heard about it. And 240,000 citizens came to Washington on August 23rd, 1963. We got a Civil Rights Act. So that I would educate the male brethren by beating them at their own game, in part. But I would do more than that. I would try to appeal to their intellect. In my odd moments, when I have nothing else to do, I reflect and brood over an American society in which the average life expectancy of women in the United States is 6 to 7 years longer than men. And this is a very sad and drab prospect of a society of aging, widowed, lonely women. And I say to myself, very seriously, without any jokes about who's the weaker sex or who's the stronger sex, what is happening in our society that men are being killed off 6 or 7 years younger than the women, leaving this tragic situation of older women aging without men? I happen to believe in a coeducational society, and so for me, this is a tragedy. And I say to myself that America is a competitive society, and Harvard, heavens knows, is sort of par excellence of the symbol of competitiveness for prestige and power. But I'm wondering if, instead of taking guns and shooting ourselves down, if we're not killing ourselves off by having overemphasized competitiveness, getting ahead, organization man, reaching the top, etc. The women, many of them, in their submerged position, have not been exposed to this. And while I'm no scientist and cannot say, it just seems to me ordinary common sense that part of what is back of heart attacks and strokes and the kinds of diseases that are taking men away from here sooner than they should be going indicates and is symptomatic of some of the pressures of the kind of competitive society in which one group, by and large, shares or maintains the power exclusively. Now, I would be willing to trade the life expectancy of women for a sharing of power that would mean human beings generally, all things considered, would be moving off the scene at relatively the same time. And I say this in all seriousness. I think it is a serious problem.
It is now 10:20. I think that last point of Miss Murray's is a point on which all persons of goodwill and even a good many of bad will could agree. I think what you've heard is a rather remarkable demonstration of the fact that there is genuine concern about this problem, and intense concern, at least on the part of a small number. From them, I am certain more will be heard in the future. I have no doubt of that. But at the moment, I don't get the sense that they are really very much agreed with respect to the precise character of the problem or what should be done about it, in the sense of still having some doubts among themselves as to where the emphasis should be. I'm afraid that so long as women remain a house divided, the men will continue to say, dare we not discriminate? That is not something that leaves me very happy. Good night.